Hello.
Hi.
Hello, ma'am. Yes, sorry. There was some issue
Hi.
with the internet. Yes. I think everyone can.
Hi. Good to see you. Yeah.
Yes, yes. You could begin, ma'am. You could share your screen if you want to.
Yeah. Shall we start?
Yes, yes, yes.
Can you hear me? Is it faint or is it loud enough?
No, I think it's perfect. The sound is good.
It's perfect. Okay.
It's
All
perfect.
right. We'll start now. I'll start sharing.
Sure, sure.
Hi. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Dr. Anuradha Chatterjee. I'll be talking to you about sort of design exploration this afternoon. I am sharing with you a studio project that we did at Abni Institute of Design in Kerala. The project was called the Cultural Interpretation Center at Mahi, which is sort of at the border of Kerala, but it's actually in the Union Territory of Pondicherry. So the thematic exploration that we were undertaking was narrative, sense, and space. A cultural interpretation center, I think if you all might be aware, I'm not sure on what level of study you're in, but cultural interpretation center is something in between a museum and a gallery. And it is always very, very contextual because it depends on what culture, what city, what region, what nation you're actually designing this in, and who are you designing it for. So the semester 5 project that we were looking at, and as the studio abstract says, it had students design a cultural interpretation center, expected students to understand the complexity in the cultural history of Mahi, the city, consolidate oral histories and memories, and construct a narrative that the students felt was shared and meaningful. It was expected that this narrative would be realized through the spatial and tectonic design and the material detailing of the Cultural Interpretation Center, which is a mixed-use public building, and it was a significant building in the vicinity of the Mahi waterfront. So students had to design a building that was not just functional, but it would also have evocative spatial qualities appropriate to an experiential project. So the Cultural Interpretation Center has to do much more than fulfill its function of display and public use and administration and archive and library. It has to do much more than that, and it has to really be an experiential space that is relevant to the locals as well as to the tourists. So Mahi is it was a small French trading post which was set up in the southern west Malabar coast of India. It was established in 1725 and captured by the British during the French Revolution in 1793. And in 1816, the British returned Mahi to the French again, and it remained with France till about 1954 when the freedom struggle led Mahi to join the Indian Union. So it is a very complex sort of a space that it has a very strong French history, but it's also part of the Malabar coast. The people there speak Malayalam, but they're not Malayali. They don't consider themselves as part of Kerala, even though they're literally at the border. And there are many sort of remains in terms of built fabric. You can still see a lot of historic buildings that are still existing from the French and the British times. But how we started with Mahi we didn't get into a site and context study straight away. We took a slightly different approach, which was looking at the novel by a Mahi novelist. He's a very well-known novelist. His name is M. Mukundan, as you can see from the cover here. And this is the English translation of the Malayalam book, which is called On the Banks of the Mayeri, which is a Malayalam name for Mahi, the river Mahi. Why we started with novel is that, as this quotation here says, Mukundan's novels on Mayeri are perfect examples of history in fiction. The novels are shaped with the history of Mahi as a backdrop, and the changes that take place in the small principality became the canvas on which the characters are painted with a touch of humanness. So we really wanted to challenge this idea of studying the everyday, studying just going to the context and kind of diving into that. We said, why don't we delay this a bit and start with a novel? And the novel is obviously based on, because the novelist is from Mahi, the novel is obviously based on characters and memories and tales and fiction that are not really stories, but they're in fact stories of people who have lived and loved in Mahi. So, which was the reason why we really started with looking at the novel. So the first exercises the students did was to read the novel. Each student was given one chapter. And so I'm just stopping that for a minute and saying, look, so this is a walk. This is a wall that leads up to the waterfront in Mahi. And the murals, you see these murals here on the wall. These are in fact scenes depicting. These are images sort of depicting scenes from the novel, from the Mukunda novel itself. So we thought that we were really happy to have made a really good selection in the way we were going to enter the project. So each student was given a chapter. So the specific methodology for the studio is that it started with a novel, and instead of diving into the context and site, like I told you, we wanted students to inhabit this fictive material space. So it's a material space, but at the same time, it's a fiction. We wanted them to understand the city through the novel, and to understand that the characters of the novel could be as real as the people who lived, in or live in Mahi. So each student, if you see these little tiles, these graphic tiles, each student was given one chapter, and they had to produce between 5 to 10 tiles from the chapter, capturing what they thought were very significant moments in terms of event. What was the event happening in it? What was the space the event was happening in? And what was the emotion? So each of these tiles were produced by, so there were about 35 chapters. So we ended up with about 155 to about 160 tiles. So each chapter, like I said, generated 4 to 5 tiles, with each tile being a spatial vignette. So each chapter, 4 to 5 tiles, and each student was reading one chapter. And like I said, it would be capturing a spatial quality or setting. What was the space it was happening in? Was it a natural backdrop? Was it a domestic space? Was it a public space? What was the emotion of the atmosphere? There was anger? Was it anxiety? Was it confusion? Was it happiness? Was it satisfaction? What was it? And what was the event? What was the event? What was happening there? So this is something that we wanted students to capture in their tiles. And so what you see here is that the fictive space is then converted into a graphic novel installation. So the space of the novel, because they are just words, but they're more than words. They're in fact images. They are imagined spaces. Okay, imagine that the novel is in fact a space you can enter. And now this fictive space is made visible as a graphic novel installation. The process was in fact was a collaborative one, as you can see here. All the students, so this is what it looked like. Imagine that the entire novel has been made into a graphic novel as a collaborative act between the students, right? So this fictive material space of the novel is made tangible. We said now, at that point, let's go and do a context study. So this was made tangible with a context study of Mahi. Students combined physical study of the building with the process of deep listening and consolidating oral histories to amplify their understanding of the city as a client. So it was really important for them to understand that they're designing the interpretation center for the city. And the city is a client. And they had to listen very carefully and listen deeply as to what people were saying. They had to listen. They had to listen to the stories of legends and fiction and rituals that have stayed on. What is culture? They really had to focus on what is the current and what was the historic culture of Mahi and what is worth holding on to. So what you see on the slide here is in fact remnants from, and these buildings are also mentioned in the Mukunda novel. So you see there's a strong connect. The temple is mentioned there, the mosque is mentioned there, and the shrine, the Centuriza shrine there. These spaces are all mentioned in the novel itself. So therefore, therefore it was really interesting that we started to first look at the idea of the novel and then start to look at the city and try to understand how the city has developed around these kind of landmarks, right? So students also developed a deep understanding of Mahi as a fiction and reality, as past and present, and as tangible and intangible. They would have had a solid sense of what Mahi wants and needs, and how to position the cultural interpretation as a local, regional, and national destination. So what was really important in this kind of an engagement with the community, and that's if you see my cursor moving on the screen, that is the novelist we were talking about. That is M. Mukundan, and so the students were also able to talk to the novelist. And here are people who are local MLAs. They really had to understand what is a cultural interpretation center, and what it needed to have for the local people, for visiting, for local visitors, so for people who are doing interstate tourism, and also for national and international visitors, right? So the place also has relevance to French travelers, as well as international travelers, as well as national travelers within India as well. So they really had to understand and get a sense of what the identity of this building would be. The study also focused on the understanding and the transformation of urban and cultural landscape. So students were looking for signs of continuities as well as disruptions of memories, myths, legends, stories, identities, rituals, practices, ways of living, and important sites and buildings. So this was not just historical, but it was also done through a lot of people-to-people interaction. This informed what the students produced as a statement of culture that would form the foundation for the program of the Cultural Interpretation Center. So, we strongly believed that if you don't understand the place, you are not in a position to write an architectural program for the building that is really strong and relevant. So this process was incredibly important. Now, there was a kind of a detour. We said, okay, so now we asked the students to think about the graphic tiles. Remember the graphic tiles that the students converted from the chapters into the 4 or 5 tiles they were looking at. So we asked each of the students to try to convert that into a material spatial volume. So it is one thing, what happens in a lot of design studios is that you do a lot of case studies and you do a lot of context studies, you do a lot of oral histories, but you don't know how to convert that. When you start to design, you start from scratch, and then it becomes a really bland and a very boring sort of a project. So we said, okay, so one way we can really tackle this is through an exploratory process of converting an image into a material spatial volume. And when I say volume, I mean an interior space, not an exterior space. An exterior space is a mass, and an interior space is a volume. So it's a material spatial. Why am I using the term material spatial? Because I wanted the students to understand that the space, the volume, that the inhabitable volume is constructed through materiality or material. And by materials, I don't mean brick, concrete, bamboo, wood. I don't mean that. What I meant by material is material qualities. Are we talking about heaviness, lightness, thinness, glossiness, dampness, the qualities of materials? I did not want them to talk to me about whether the material was brick or concrete. That would come at a later stage. So the students started to convert each of the tiles into a distinct material spatial volume at a scale of roughly 1:100, and which were a set of about 6 to 8 loosely connected volumes that are different, but they can be combined as well. So I didn't want them to jump into, doing the plan straight away. I wanted them to first look at how to convert the tile. The tile had event, space, and emotion, remember? And that was a memory that was coming out of the novel. So I said, out of the entire novel, take about 6 to 8 tiles and convert them into a volume or volumes. So these are the range of different iterations that the students came up with. So here you will always see that there's a juxtaposition of at least 1 to 2 or maximum 3 materials. We did ask them to restrict, so say obviously it cannot just be 1, but it can't be more than 3. So we said a combination of either 1 to 3 or 1 to 2 different. So we wanted what is that experience of looking at that image, and how do you translate that into a 3-dimensional volume that you can inhabit? It is an entirely subjective exercise. It is not a scientific exercise, and so there isn't a question of if it is right or wrong. So the focus was really a lot on exploration rather than the rightness and wrongness of that translation. That is another student. Again, she took two different tiles and started to try to convert them into smaller sort of volume at roughly the scale of 1:100. And that's another example that we're looking at. And that's more external, but that's nevertheless another example. So what the logic of doing this is this title here. So it threads stories within stories. Now, when you read a novel, and you all read, when you read a novel or when you see a movie, you never remember the story in its entirety. You don't remember it scene by scene, plot by plot. You never remember it in a linear way. You never remember it as in a sequence in which you saw it or read it, ever. So understand that the psychology of remembering, or the psychology of memory, is one of fragment, but also it's also a logic of continuity. So what we said is that from the larger novel of 35 chapters and 155 tiles, I said if you really had to, there are stories within stories. When you kind of revisit novels that you read, or just go back to your favorite films, you will know that the larger plot has micro plots inside it. So we wanted them to kind of pull that out, and they started to do that by using these tiles that all the different students had made. And the fact that they said that they could tell a story just by looking at these 6 tiles, and they don't have to be 6 in a kind of a sequence. It means that they could pick them at any particular order, as long as they could tell a story within the story, right? So like it says here, students will select certain key events or episodes to eventually translate them into a spatial 3-dimensional framework. It's a kind of a bubble diagram, but here the graphic map has a narrative function. So what they're doing is creating a narrative function. We haven't yet talked about the architectural function yet. So we're delaying that. Now, what you're looking here, what we see on the screen here is an assemblage. We said, if you go back to the screen and say from each of these, so if I take each of these as, kind of manifestations of each tile, it is possible to actually join them together. It's actually possible to integrate them into what is architectonic. Our students really struggle with this idea of architectonic, and I think it is a slightly tricky thing to understand. What we said is it's not architectural, it's architectonic. What does that mean? It's not a fancy word, it means something. It means that it has the DNA of the building. It has the tectonic qualities of what the building, what it is becoming a building, but it is not yet a building. But at the same time, it is spatial and 3-dimensional and has all the qualities of verticality, horizontality, juxtaposition, collision of volumes, all the different things that we talk about, different use of materials. It has a capability of being developed and translated into an actual building. And this phase was very, very important, that we were really clear that we didn't want to start with floor plans. The floor plans would come later on. And that makes the process much more risky, but a lot more exploration. Definitely, there's a lot of anxiety tied to this kind of a method, So that was one of the examples that you looked at. That's another example. Again, as you can see here, these are conceptual, these are architectonic volumes, they're not architectural spaces. But when you do combine them together, it is possible to imagine that something like this can be developed, can be reimagined as an actual precinct for an interpretation center, right? Not just going back and forth, so bear with me. Siting, grounding. So this is a waterfront here. That's the Mahi waterfront, and the site is quite literally here. That's a government house, and so it's an important institutional street, and the building responds to the waterfront, as well as the fact that it's an important street which has a lot of institutions. I'm not sure if you can see that, but that's that little space over there. So it's a corner site. You have a primary road here and a secondary road here, and that's a government house precinct. And that's the river, and that's the space beyond the river. So that's the context within which the building is sitting. So the site is a corner site in this road called the Collectorate Road in front of Tagore Park, which is a very important space in Mahi and in the vicinity of important institutions. The site also has an intact historic house. So do you see this building here? That's in fact a French colonial house that has remained on that site, which we wanted to leave there and have the students actually adapt that for the use in the Cultural Interpretation Center. That's another view. That is the front of the site. That's the main. So you're walking up. So that's a view of the site, walking up to the site, and that's the old building there. And you see if my cursor is moving there, that's a secondary road. So it's a corner site. So all of that area is a site, right? And that's an important site condition in this particular site is that there's a view to the park and there's a view across Tagore Park to Mahi River. The historic house actually divides. So that's a back of the historic house that bifurcates the site and requires that the proposed schemes to actually work around it. Okay, so the house is sort of sitting on the front, but a little bit into the site itself, and you would have to work your new sort of proposed building around it. So what we got the students to do, we still haven't, just bear in mind, at this point, we still haven't discussed area statement and architectural program yet. We're delaying that. We haven't gotten there yet, yeah, but we will get there. So these models, so we asked students and said, this is the site, and that's a corner there. That's a corner there. And that's the historic house, if you can see my cursor move, right? So we said, we'd like you to explore these different volumes and what would it look like, how to do a massing. Now you all, architecture students all do this massing, which is what exactly, it's kind of volumes it's functions converted into kind of masses, and then you kind of test that on site as to what, three-dimensional massing is testing of that. We want the students to kind of look at how you might assemble these volumes onto the site and how you might negotiate architectural program into that, because we said that these are not fixed volumes. These are, like we said, like it has a code or the DNA of the building that it wants to become, but it's not architecture yet. So, but we wanted them to use the three-dimensional volumes. And remember, these spatial material volumes are meant to contain the memory, the emotion that the student had actually derived from the graphic tiles and from the novel itself. So we asked them to kind of look at how to do kind of a site massing. Of course, we did a proper site massing as well, but we wanted them to kind of say what happens when you start to put them on site. And again, these are examples. Again, that's a historic house. And these are the different volumes, and say what happens if you do an L-shaped arrangement, what happens, and what does that mean in terms of creating different kinds of spaces? That is a much more defensible space at the back with a public space in front. So because it's a corner site, the students also had to think very carefully about how they are creating thresholds and how they are creating sort of intermediate semi-public or public spaces as part of their as part of the design project. And here's the iteration we were looking at before. And here's some other examples that it starts to take up, so that's again, so because it is a two-sided plot, students had to think about how, and especially one that is divided by a historic house on it. And it's about 3 frontages. So that's 1 frontage, that's 2 frontage, and that's a third. So it's almost about 3 buildings. The site is about 1950 square meters, and it's about 3 frontages worth. If you look at the frontages of the buildings on the Collectorate Road itself. So we wanted them to think about, how many entries would the building have, where it would be able to be locked up, where it would remain open as a public space. So all of these decisions were also to be taken not at the plan level, but through the use of models. That was really important for us. And these are the kind of examples that you start to get the first iteration of what the building form might be, right? The architectural program is something that we wanted to talk to students about, and that's something that they developed, which was a maximum built-up area of about 1,500 square meters to I think of a ground coverage about 33% of the site area, according to the bylaws there. Now, the architecture program for the Interpretation Center is fairly straightforward for a semester 5 studio. The reason for that is that because the Interpretation Center can be anything that you want it to be. It's a very fluid typology, unlike an art gallery or a museum, which is pretty fixed in the kind of spaces and programs and services that it requires. The Interpretation Center is it can be interpreted, if that makes sense. The Interpretation Center program itself can be interpreted to become something quite local, quite textual, quite, kind of contextual and fitted into the place. So we talked to students about the fact that we needed display spaces, we needed spaces, we needed a retail space, we needed a dining space, we needed different kinds of display conditions. We needed probably an archive, where local histories and oral histories could be archived. There would be an admin, there would be a curator. So it was it's a medium, the small to medium scale building that we wanted them. When we kept the built up area and the site really small, also because the exploration, because the complexity of the project was at a very different level, you see. That's why we kept the size of the building, the bulk of the building, we limited that, right? So like we say here, the architectural program was negotiated into these initial, volumetric massing and volumetric siting, which required students to move away from three-dimensional spatial, move from three-dimensional spatial and sensorial to the planar organizational approach. See, normally you start with a plan and then you build a 3D, or that you build this model onto that, right? We reverse the process. We said, what happens when you take a three-dimensional approach and a spatial approach and a sensorial approach? And from that, you try to map the plan and map the organization to that, to accommodate functions and movements. And also there would be 2 or 3 different kinds of circulatory routes, not too many, because it's a very simple building. You'd have something that is a long route through the Interpretation Center, or short route, public route to the Interpretation Center, and a private one in which that is only connected perhaps to the library and to the director's office and to the curator's office. So there's about 2 to 3 routes, circulation paths that you can imagine through this building. It's not an institution. It's not a large institution, so it's not really complex. So we said that, yes. So how do we convert the three-dimensional into the planar? How do we accommodate? How do you negotiate functions into that? And how do you work your circulation into that? What needs to change? And so we start, and these are the kinds of the first iteration. So we're calling it architectural becomings. When your idea starts to become architecture, so that's your first becomings. When we start to get students to say, okay, so how do you really organize your bulk, your 1,500 square meters of bulk onto the site? So we looked at precedents. Normally we said, well, you're probably wondering, where is the case study of the Interpretation Center? We asked the students to do the case studies on their own to understand what were the different, and they're all totally different. So on the left here, you can see this is an Interpretation Center in Australia. This is in South Africa, and I think this is in Mexico. And they are completely different, and they have completely different objectives. Like I said, an Interpretation Center can be a communal space, it can be an institutional space, it can be a gallery space, it can be focused on learning, on capacity building, or on archiving, or on display. It really depends on your contextual study, and only then can you really understand what the architectural program of such a building can be. So it's not fixed, it is not set in stone. And that's something that the students had to understand by studying these precedents themselves. What we also made them do in the precedent study is that we got them to actually, I don't know if you can see these images very clearly, but we got them to study public buildings, modern buildings by sort of modern architects like Le Corbusier, Mies van der Rohe, Louis Kahn, different architects. We wanted them to understand how public buildings are organized, and that lesson and how they can transfer that understanding. So we didn't want them to like literally map an interpretation center and and kind of copy that. We wanted them to think across, think laterally. So we got them to study public buildings done by other architects and say, well, how is the structure organized? How is the circulation organized? How is the material organized? How are the functions organized? What are the hierarchies? How do they go about achieving it? What is the design method of this architect? So I think that was really important, because the semester 5, at least in our is when students are designing a public building, an institution building for the first time. So they needed to actually learn how public buildings are organized. So we got them to do this kind of precedent or party diagrams of different modern buildings. So here's a student's architectural program. So here, as you can see here, the student is responding to this idea that, as you can read here, that the change is to the spoiled image of drinking. So, Mahi is also quite famous or infamous for drinking. You get very cheap alcohol there, and so it's come to the point when it really seems people there are really concerned about the fact that that the culture is deteriorating, that there is really no culture there. Even though Mahi has a very strong local culture, local communities there, there's French culture, there's British culture, there's of course Indian culture. It's actually quite important. And here the student, as you can see, this understanding is, what is the objective? Responding to the other edge through art as an extension of Balagram, as a resting place, an extension of the park and amenities, reviving Kalyani Amma. So there's a person there who actually runs a mess, and that had been set just after independence. And so they said, how can we continue all of that? So like I said, the architectural program is not the same as an area statement. See, the area statement comes out when you have the architectural program is the identity of the building. It is what is it aiming to do, and why is it aiming to do that? So that was very important for them to understand before they went on to deciding what the function is. And here I'm just showing you a few plans. We'll have the time to go into it in detail. And these are the kinds of, so this is a pretty radical, pretty out there sort of design. But the student is thinking of a winery, of this kind of a grid, and this idea that that this building is sort of unfinished. I'm just going to show you a few examples. They're not good or bad, they're just different from each other. And here's another student who starts to look at, it's a very rich culture. I'm not sure if you can read it on your screens or not, but here again, this statement here is actually quite important. And the area statement, as you can see, is different. So the student says that in order to achieve the architectural program, you need these functions and these area statements that add up to 1,500 square meters of built-up area. So we said, okay, so there's a gallery, there's a transition, there's a screening space, there's shopping, there's obviously the circulation, there's another gallery, which is a different kind of a gallery, there's a cafeteria, there's also the services. So students would have to work that out in order to achieve the objectives of the architectural program. What are the functions you need, and how large do they need to be? What is the capacity and the occupancy of each of these spaces? And they had to work all that out, which is actually really important at this stage. And again, these are quite kind of straightforward plan. The students working on a grid and on this idea of maze and ramp. So the sequence of movement that he's showing here is that you enter through one of these spaces and then you move into a space. So there's kind of this idea of going in and out. That was his narrative, and he was building on that from the different volumetric models that he was exploring initially. Right, and that's his physical model. So a lot of buildings also ended up having an open space inside where you would have collective functions like theater performances, these are quite important functions that you would like to have in an interpretation center. So a lot of spaces obviously you have a lot of this underground area was quite free for people to walk into. So like he shows here, that this undercroft is not really programmed as an unprogrammed space that would get programmed when when the local communities have functions or gatherings or markets or festivals, So it's a question of how the interpretation center is also providing a space for things to happen that is relevant and valid for people who live there. So it's not just a hard-edged institution that is not just a building, but it's also about creating urban and public space opportunities. Here's another example of a student who's dealing with this idea again of interface, and she creates this almost like a pinwheel, like a cross-shaped configuration, and with these smaller micro courtyards, and there's a lot of transition. There are smaller spaces nestled inside larger spaces, and so there's a kind of a very, kind of an understanding that you're creating courtyards of different kinds, and that you kind of move from one to the other to the other. So there's kind of a narrative and a journey that she's also building into this building. And those are just some examples. There's some views of looking at, what it might be like to actually look across when you're inside this precinct. Here's another example of a student who's playing with this idea of the gable roof or the hipped roof that you start to see in Kerala, and he kind of plays with that. I mean, he doesn't kind of respect it. He really extends it and plays with that. And so you start to see a kind of it's not ridiculous, but it's kind of a playfulness that you start to see and say, if I use that as a module and start to kind of multiply that, what does it mean? So again, this idea of entering the building at the ground level. So that's a historic house. As you can see, he's transformed that. He's re-roofed it. He's transformed a very traditional structure into something quite different. He's created another gallery and a veranda at the top, and here's a linking thing at the back. There are courtyards that are linked across, and there's a bridge going on top. So the different experiences. And here on the corner here, he's created another space here, and you can obviously, as you can see, you can walk through it. So which means that this space here is probably more public than perhaps this space here, which is a lot more defensible. So again, how do you create different spaces within the site? How do you create different routes of movement? Like I said, there'd be about 2 to 3 circulatory routes within the building, which one would be the long route, in which a visitor who has enough time to see the interpretation center will see everything, and somebody who wants to see one thing and leave the building, so that's a short route. And then there's of course the private route for people who actually work there, which means that they are not visitors, they are occupants, they actually work there. So we are talking about different kinds of users and different kinds of visitors. Like I said, because it is a large frontage, the idea of active front is very important. You can't really have boundary walls or dead walls because that would be a negative. It would not be contributing to the urban realm. So that's really important to think of how you will activate this edge, because you are taking up 3 frontages. So it's an urban responsibility for you. And of course, there are these ideas that you're also gifting back public space to the city. So just because an interpretation center is sort of it is a public building, but it's not public in the sense. I mean, it does get locked up at night. So, but in the sense that are you just using that site to just build your building, or are you giving something back to the public as well, so that they can use? So something like that is a lot more permeable and a lot more porous, so people can start to use that. That's again just looking at some of these spaces a bit closely. Yeah. So I think the kind of structure, I think if I can just, the reason I said non-linear meanderings. So it's actually really important because see, when we say design studio, the process is fairly straightforward. The way you move, and almost, at least in my experience as a studio educator, I've seen that you almost always move in the same direction in the same way. So we said, like, how can we make it, how can we build in a bit of risk, and a bit of uncertainty into the design process, which is really important and fun. I mean, it can be fun or it can be nerve-wracking, depends on what kind of a student you are. If you like risk and if you like uncertainty, you would love it. If you don't like that uncertainty, you're going to hate it, because that suddenly that certainty of moving from site analysis, zoning, massing, plan, model is then taken away. So just let's see how we went about it. Let's see these different verticals. How do we go about it? So we are not working in a linear way. We are working with parallel streams, if that makes sense, and we're meandering in and out of these streams. So if you look at each of these 1, 2, 3, 4 as a vertical stream, we are meandering in and out of them. So it's not like we do one first and then two and then three and then four. It's not like that at all. So I mean, it's sort of sequential, but it's not just sequential. So the first thing we did was look at the novel, read the novel to each other, do the graphic tiles, take out the micro narratives out of the novel, create those little stories within larger stories, using the graphic tiles. The second was the architectonic model, but that was not after the micro narratives. That was happening just after the graphic tiles, right? And then the micro narratives happened, then the assemblages happened. Right? We started to combine these different models together and say, well, let's see if we can actually combine them into a precinct or a building. What does that mean? Then we started to cite the assemblages. We said, let's do a citing. At the same time, we went to cite and we started doing cite and context study. While we were doing cite and assemblages, we started zoning, but here we started doing more of a functional zoning. And we also started to look at cultural history and significance at this point. But then we also started looking at architectural programs. So again, it is not sequential. So there are overlaps between each of these stages, and they're happening a lot of times 1, 2, maybe happening together, sometimes 1, 2, and 3, maybe happening together, sometimes 3 and 4, maybe happening together. Right? So the architectural program discussions we were constantly having, every time we're going on site, we start to discuss, well, what is the identity? What is the programmatic identity of this building that we're designing on the site, in the city, at this location? What does it mean? So we started this discussion, but we closed it really after, all of this was finished with the area statement. And then, of course, the prelim design, the pre-final, and the final design. So steps were sequential, but like I said, the creative methodology was neither linear nor strong. So it wasn't that we wanted to force students down the track. We didn't want to force them down a tunnel, that you have to do this, and we have to do this, and you have to do this. It wasn't like that, because then it becomes not fun. We realized how students have a way of subverting anything that is a straitjacket, and we started questioning how much one should really drive a particular methodology. So even as teachers, educators, even for us, it was a learning process as saying, well, this is a methodology, and a lot of the methodology was also evolving. But how much do you really force it? That is a really important question. So we valued stage learning, and we marked, each stage was marked. So even if you didn't do that stage, you could still move to the next stage. It wasn't like a video game where you had to, finish one stage and only then you could progress, because that would be really restricting for students, because every student has their own creative journey and their own creative map. So it's really important that the studio methodology respect that. So hence, while students had an affinity for the second stream, which is this architectonic models and assemblages, which they developed further with the help of the third and fourth streams, which is site and architecture program, there are other students who were inspired more by the first stream work, more by the narratives. They were really in love with what they did in the first stage. They sort of did this badly, or they kind of did it, and then they moved straight on to site and architectural program, and they also did that really well. So again, the question about that, how you create a methodology that allows you to meander, to loiter, to move in and out of stages without being straitjacketed and or being, being kind of pulled, being shoved down a tunnel. So, like I said, and they went straight to narrative side and program. Others found greater safety in starting again from the third and fourth stream and finishing well. So a lot of students said, well, I'm not happy with this. I wasn't happy with that. So it's also about personal satisfaction. They were not happy with that. So they said, well, I really want to start with site and go and maybe I'll go back to narrative. So again, this is we didn't do this in the beginning. This is something that we did post factum, that we did this after the studio had ended. So we said map the methodology. We realized that it was not a linear methodology where you have to take step 1 and 2. If you miss step 2, you can't do step 3. If you do step 2 badly, you'll do your step 3 badly, and step 4. So we did not want to take that kind of an approach. And I think, it again was a kind of a really space of anxiety and a risk for us as educators as well. I think it's really important to understand that as educators, if you know the outcome of the studio, you're being really safe, and it's never going to be fun teaching. These are just some ideas. These are just some feedback that we got from our students. So, so here's a student here who says that the Semester 5 studio was a new way of learning and doing things, very much exploratory in nature in both conceptual an architectonic stage and design stage where we could make our own programs and statements, do it as an interpretation center. I personally learned to look at a lot of things from a different perspective from the initial stage of architectonic models, i.e. reading and making, which then developed. So they really enjoyed that, and each student had their own feedback on, what was satisfying for them, what was a learning journey, and what was a learning outcome for that semester. So that's the group of students that I worked with, and that's the end of the lecture. Thank you so much.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you. Now I think I can open the floor for questions. If any of you have questions, it's okay if you don't want to type the entire question in the chat. You can just raise a hand. You can just message me. I'll unmute you. It's not advisable to unmute the entire lot of participants because we are around 300. It will be very chaotic. But you can just raise a hand, or you can just sort of message me. I'm unmuting Harshit because he has a question. So let us begin with Harshit first.
Okay. Hello, ma'am. Can you hear me?
Harshit is an assistant professor at
Okay.
Institute of Architecture and Research, ma'am. He's a colleague. Harshit, yes, please proceed with your question.
Yes, yes, ma'am. The context of the site which you have shown is in south of India, and it have significant architectural patterns in the context, which are time tested, and they respond to the warm and humid climate of the region very well, and they are also supportive to the social behavior of people there. So was there any specific part in the process which helps students to understand the local traditional architecture and use the learnings in design development? So was there any part in the process which helps students to understand the local traditional architecture and use those learnings in design development? That's my first question.
Yes.
Harshit, that's a really good question. I see. So we have talked to students about climatology and understanding the climatic consequences of whatever they were designing. So we did look at. We didn't really have time for documentation. What we should have done, I mean, if you had a longer studio, what we should have done was undertaken a documentation of the local patterns and as you mentioned, the architectural styles and traditions. But we did look at Kerala as a region and just ideas of orientation and ventilation. We didn't we from the beginning, however, in terms of stylistic approach though, we told the students that their building could either be contextual or iconic. So they could we wanted them to kind of break out of the mold as well and try to see how they might. So if they wanted to make, that was their choice as well. So we left that to them, that whether they wanted to, if they wanted to do something contextual, their case studies or the precedent studies would have to include local sort of the smaller public buildings, or if they wanted to do something iconic, they could do that as well. So it wasn't, we didn't want to take but the climate and the climate part of it, climate and habitation part of it was quite important, and that's something that we constantly guided them through, but not through the study of not through documentation of buildings, but through study of buildings, published studies.
Okay, thank you. There is one more question. Often when we are teaching studios, when we are conducting studios, there is always a specific lot of students who are fascinated by non-conventional dynamic and fluidic forms. They are much more inclined towards Franco-Gehry, and so how do those kind of students uh, took this exercise? How were they influenced by this exercise, or what was their reaction and output?
So I think if I understand the question correctly, saying that people who the students who are very drawn to this idea of non-linear
Yes,
shapes
yes,
and
yes,
forms, I think,
yes.
and sort of more dynamic forms. We didn't really force anybody to look at any particular kind of architects. That's why we sort of ask asked them to look at modern students. We asked students to look at modernist architects. So we stopped like not postmodernist and not sort of high modernist. So, but the difficulty that I think the challenge that we found with this methodology, like I said, students not being satisfied with a particular step or taking a step very seriously. You know, the 4 streams that we looked at in the methodology. Some of them were like, well, why do I have to do this architectonic model? And so having faith in the process, I think that was something that we struggled, and that's why some of the students didn't. Couple of students didn't really get on board because they were like, well, I don't. This is very different. I'm not sure. This seems like a very different way to proceed. And when you don't know something, when something is very new, you get really scared of it because it's new. So that was one of the challenges, but we didn't really have issues with students who had a. We realized that at this point in semester 5, they don't really have an affinity for any certain kind, any particular style or a signature, which is a good thing, really. So they seemed fairly open, but thankfully. But the challenges were there in terms of getting them on board and saying, so why do I have to do it like this? To break the pattern, after by semester 5, a pattern is already set in, and they want to do things in a certain way. Even though you want to explore, you still want to have the safety of following the same process every time. And in this case, we really want to challenge that. That's why I said, Harshit, we kept the building program small, less complex, because otherwise they wouldn't be able to handle everything. Sort of answers your question. I'm not sure.
Yes. Thank you.
Okay. I think, ma'am, another colleague of mine, Professor Vijay Patel, he has a question. I'll just unmute him. Yes, Vijay?
Yeah.
Ha.
Ma'am, I have a question. Since you had a different approaches on design, one is a narrative approach in architecture, and second is say a standard way when the students approach the design when they do a context study, and then a standard what is the program and what is how do they respond to the site, and then they create a design. So in a first approach, which is like a narrative approach, how did students responded to this, and what kind of readings they were asked to do? So see, it is very intense approach where when you have to create something which is very imaginary and which takes you through some kind of a story. So how did you guided them to take this approach, and how were the results at the end finally?
I'll just unmute ma'am just a minute so that she can. Yes.
Yeah, that's a really good question. We didn't have any specific readings in terms of narrative architecture because we didn't want, and we didn't want to show them any specific examples of buildings that have been used, buildings that have used a particular approach, because then they will start to kind of copy and mimic that. So I mean, every interpretation center has its own. So we showed them examples of interpretation centers where a certain narrative has been followed. In terms of results, so as you saw from the architectonics the students had made. I'll just share the screen with you for a little bit again.
Sure.
So I mean, I'm showing you the larger number of slides. So these are the kinds of the kinds of explorations that students had. So they were much space. Let's say really confused and exactly going really. May not see it like that. So this idea of plurality of interpretation, plurality of experience is also something that they had to get on with. So like I said, the performance of students was not even. So some students tended to do very well in the narrative in this part. some students tended to do really well in this part, and so they would, but then and then going into the site, that was a different thing altogether, because for instance, here this idea that if that's if that is your site, you need to think about where, what are you trying to create, because you've got a historic building sitting right here. You have to adapt that. So there's an element of adaptive reuse coming into that as well. And then, are you going to put the new buildings right smack bang in the back of it, or are you going to create a courtyard, or is the courtyard going to be facing the back, which is going to be accessed through the? So again, they had to understand the site also at an urban level, because we're talking about creating public spaces. It is near the government house, and it's, it is actually a very important public space where there's a lot of gathering of people happens for protests and sort of common discussions. It is fronting onto the to-go park here, which is actually a very important, a very, very significant public space. So what they have to think of this as in continuity, and then there's a river across, and so what is the view that you're getting across into the river? So so when they did the siting, we really wanted them to kind of think of all of that. So they're kind of interrelated, ideas, but they're not, so I don't know if it sort of answers your question or not, but like I said, we had to go through these different steps to really get, and they were not all, linear.
Some sort, yeah. What we are is on the same way. It's just that in a narrative, because we also tried somewhere with this approach in narrative, then how do you take that as a starting point, and rather than being very focused on a program-oriented approaches, and how do you take sequentially, how do you create those experiences and convert experiences into architecture? The program is secondary. How do you place it?
It's damn hard. It's damn hard, and it's
very difficult.
Yeah, it's really hard.
We are also trying the same thing, but it takes a lot of time. But also, we were struggling that what kind of examples we showed them, that sometimes it is very difficult to convey this, or maybe it takes time. So we were looking for some references where we can take them through those similar projects, or a narrative behind the projects, so they understand maybe slightly in a better way. So it's a struggle. Yeah, it's going on.
I totally 100% empathize, because it's a, like I said, it's one thing to design something, and it's another thing that the user or the visitor may not feel or may not really understand what you're trying to do. So there is also that element, that variation, that variable is there as well. So I think the success is if the student has even a percentage of that narrative in the end, that, remember when we started with this idea, and then, if it's there in the end, I think it's pretty successful, I mean, if you can call it that. But it may not be exactly what they started with, because it's such a difficult thing, to tell a story through architecture. It is so hard to control. How do you control that? How do you make people feel? That's why the studio was called sensing space. How do you, because it's a non-verbal, right? We're converting a novel, these ideas, the stories, how do you convert something that is verbal into non-verbal? Architecture is a text, but at the same time, it's non-verbal. It doesn't speak to you it doesn't tell you. So that was exciting. But at the same time, you need students to be on board and say, okay, I'll be on this really unpredictable journey, and having the faith that you'll actually get somewhere interesting. I think that's a very important process, I think. But yeah, it's a good question. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Okay. Just a minute. There's one more question. I'll just unmute the participant. I think, hello, Chintan sir, can you hear me? Professor Chintan?
Yes.
Chintan sir, I think you can ask the question on behalf of the student which you have just posted to Anuradha madam.
Just a minute.
Okay.
Yeah.
Please mention the name. If
Yeah. One of our students is Nikhil Pithawa. His question is, if I have to explore heritage typology in urban context, so how can it be regarded as, in your opinion?
just a minute, I'm trying to unmute, madam. Yes.
Nikhil, exploring heritage typology in urban context as it is as an adaptive reuse model, or exactly? Can you just clarify the question for me a little bit, if you don't mind?
Yes, even I was thinking the question needs to be more clear, actually.
But I think it is in context of urban morphology kind of a thing, adaptive reuse and everything. That is what he mentioned in the question.
Okay.
So I think adaptive reuse is of the specific building. So when we had, so we have on the site that we looked at in this project, the site already has a two-storied heritage, like a historic building that's in a very good condition. So we said we'd ask the students that they have to retain it for sure, and they have to find a good use for it and connect it to the new building. So therefore the question was, when you're going to put new additions onto the site, where are you going to place it? If this building is a front, it has a back. Are you going to, kind of alter the back? Are you going to be using the building for archive purposes? Does it have enough? If you change the fab, are you able to change such a load-bearing building that we had on site? And so, to what extent can you really, create modifications in a very kind of a very basic load-bearing building? But it was of a good quality and a good condition. So the question was about the use and the typology itself. It was a two. I mean, I don't have the plan for. I wasn't able to show you the plan for that. So basically, a 3-bay building. There's a front was a veranda, and then there's a back. There's a middle room, and there's so kind of a 3-bay, kind of a tripartite format, and a strictly load-bearing building. So we said, well, how much change can you make to this, and what are the opportunities of this building, and would this building be something that you enter the precinct through, so that adaptive reuse can take that into account? So does that mean, is this like, would it be like the admin, or is that or is that not an important enough use, or should it be the retail part of it? So I think the students had to come up with a very clear strategy on what would be the best use. What would be giving that building greater dignity. If a lot of students were just putting it storage and kitchen, we think you can't do that. You have to give that building, it has a presence, and it needs to be given that amount of respect and dignity. So what is that use that, that people are going to enter that building and think, oh, okay, this is really interesting. And how does that tie back into the narrative? If you're going to move through different spaces, and we said that these different volumes have different narrative elements, embedded inside them, how will you connect this? How does this historic building become part of that thread, or does it not? Or maybe it doesn't have anything to do, and that's fine as well. But their own design strategy, I think, is quite important for that.
Okay, thank you, ma'am.
Okay, there's one more question from our there's a senior faculty, Professor Manish Parikh. He has a question. The question is, how do we get them to create a bridge from narrative to fulfilling of the program? I'll just unmute, madam. Just a minute. Yes.
So this is Professor Manish, no?
Yes.
So the way we did it, Professor Manish, is that we broke the narrative down into, like we said, those individual elements that we showed, the tiles, and each of the tiles were one scene from, or one important moment from the story. So the entire story cannot be told in architecture. So the entire narrative, it's very difficult. So then how do you distill that? So it's a process of distillation. is that from the novel, there was a story, there was a, and then each chapter almost, so that narrative is coming from the story, right? So each chapter was converted into 5 to 10 different moments, which are worth remembering. Because when you hear a story, after hearing, you're also remembering, right? So it's a question of memory. Your memory is functioning from the beginning. When you're hearing, listening, remembering. So when you're reading, you're also you think what did I remember? There are 5 key points in every chapter that you will remember. This happened, and then this happened, and then this happened, and then this happened, right? So there's 5 moments. So we said, why don't you create? That's why we said we converted the narrative into 5 distinct like mic tiles, or 5 different moments, which was then converted into an image. Because see, when students are reading a novel, they are not conscious of the fact, which we found out, they are not conscious of the fact that the thinking is spatial. That no story happens, is not an unspatial act. Everything happens in life, everything that happens is a spatial act. Everything, your memory is spatial, your dreams are spatial. It always happens inside a space, right? So they're not conscious of that. Students are not conscious of that, of course, because they're still learning. But we said, well, if you're reading, how do you paint this as a space? Because it is a spatial act. So we said to convert those into 5 tiles, 5 to 10 tiles per chapter. And we said, now you convert this one image into a 3-dimensional space that you can enter. So the objective, Professor Manish, was for us to break it down, so that otherwise it gets really confusing. If you just start with the narrative and the story, and then they start telling you some stories and make something, and then ye hua, wo hua, then they start it doesn't make any sense. There is no structure or logic. So we said, let's break it down, and maybe that'll be a much more manageable way to handle it for the students. So this is our methodology. I can share a little bit more later if you'd like. But we basically broke down the story into chapters, chapters into tiles, tiles into volumes, then volumes into the larger building. So we said, but that's what I meant, we really need students to get on board and, follow us and trust us that this is something that is not crazy. We're not crazy that we asking them to do that. So that was a process of breaking it down and then bringing it back again together in the end. Yeah. I hope that helps a little bit.
Yes, sure. And the next in line is Professor Bhagyajit Rawal. He is the Dean of Faculty of Architecture and Planning, Parul University. I have unmuted him. Bhagyajit, you could proceed with your question.
Yeah, sure. Hello, ma'am. First of all, thanks a lot for accepting our invitation. It was really a wonderful presentation, especially for the process and design process for the students. My question here is in 2 parts. The first thing is that we at various architecture school, they have followed various sequencing in terms of studios. Design semester 1, they follow certain kind of design exercise, then to semester 2 to 3 to 4, like that. You are presenting the studio 5, I guess it's a semester 5. Now in our college it is more, or in 5th semester we are focusing on the institutional design. In 4th semester it is like a contextual studio. In 3rd we are now focusing on the creative aspect of the designs. It can be nature inspired design or design inspired from anything like that. So I wanted to understand the sequencing followed in your institute, in our institute. And the second part of question is that since you have also taught in China and maybe in Australia as well, so what is the difference, pedagogical difference in terms of architecture studios there, and what you experience here in India? That is what my question is. Thank you.
Just a minute, I'll try to unmute, ma'am. Yes.
Mr. Raval, very good questions, very relevant questions. First is, I think what the framework that has been followed at Avni is that the first year, because of the university syllabus, the first year is an integrated year. So the first year is all about basic design. First year, so that's 2 semesters. First year is mostly all basic design, visual arts. It's basic design, visual arts, model making, and yeah. So the three different subjects are integrated, which is learning all about the basic elements of design, and that culminates into a small design exercise, which is about an anthropometric, like one's person or 2 persons habitation. The third semester it goes into is a kind of an urban insert, but it's really looking at inhabitation of space, like space and really questioning inhabitation. But it's looking at so the projects that we're doing in semester 3 is it's not really a mixed use, but it's about the house of an artist. So again, there's a personality, there's a profile, there's a user, but the client. So this first time the students are actually looking at the idea of a client. Then fourth semester is your collective dwelling. So you start with dwelling, then collective dwelling. Fourth semester is your housing or collective dwelling. So first they did settlement design. Once they've done settlement design. Second time they've done co-housing, which is a co-housing model in Trichy, for instance. Then fifth semester is your institutional sort of campus mixed use. So it's kind of framed in a way that is based not just on typology but also scale and what it is that you're looking at. So you're going from inhabitation to looking at collectivity and infrastructure to looking at private public as well, rather than just private. And the semester 6 is looking at engineering, where structures and play of not just structures but tectonics becomes much more important. So then so for instance, the current semester 6 studio is based on a factory, is reinventing a factory. So where the idea of services and architecture and tectonic expression is coming hand in hand. And also the social aspect is also there. Then semester 7 we have it now. That's an urban insert. That again will have a campus and an urban insert. And semester 9 is a full urban design studio. Semester 8 is a training. Now, when you ask me about pedagogical differences in between India and Australia, I've taught in Australia and China, and I've taught in India, in Delhi also. Differences are, in terms of pedagogy, it's hard to say. I mean, the subjects are still the same. You still have the communication stream. You still have your technology stream, you still have your design stream, you still have your history and theory stream. So the commonality between all these contexts is that they still have these different streams, which we also have in India, which we also have in Council of Architecture. The question, the success comes when you start to integrate between these different streams, which is what we were trying here at W. We're trying to get an integration with the technology. So we were trying to get, at certain points, we're trying to do a cross subject or cross discipline integration. It's only then that it starts to become very interesting, because every curriculum in every part of the world has these different streams. There are at least 4 streams. Always theory is going to be one, structure is going to be one, design is going to be one, and maybe society or economy, one of these. Definitely 3 to 4 streams. The question is whether the studio project is able to integrate or bring in strategic integrations, say between the history or theory at certain points, buildings and construction at certain point, structures at certain point. So that was something, at least in terms of the pedagogy at AVNI, we were trying to do that. Let's not collapse everything together, because each subject and each discipline has its own expertise as well. So let's not flatten everything. But let's think of how we can get strategic intervention, which doesn't happen in a lot of colleges. But this is something that we were trying. It's much harder to achieve, but at least that's something. So that where we saw that example of the party diagrams for the history, that was our history. That was the integration with the history. We said, so we were assessing the same assessment across studio and history, theory and history. I said we're going to look at so each student was studying about 3 public buildings, because there's no better way to understand how to study a public building than to study the party, study the circulation, study the material, study the structure, study the program, study the floor area, just understand that building in context. We didn't want to handhold them and teach them everything about this is how you do an interpretation center. We wanted them to figure it out. We didn't want to say, oh, this is an interpretation center. We give them a blueprint. Oh, then the student is just going to go there. So we said, we'll show you what an interpretation center will show you later. After you've reached a certain point, then we'll show you. So I think that integration is a very important part, I think, of and pedagogical. I don't think it's a matter of superior or inferior. I think it's a matter of where you are able to get opportunities to explore and experiment. I think that's what makes it a really good context to work in, I think.
But when we refer the studio projects portfolio of students from abroad, many a times we found out that the programs are very short, small in terms of what we do it here. So we give a lot of complexity to the students, especially in India. And many schools I have observed that we are giving a lot of complexity to the student, and hence it results into maybe a less analysis, or they are not able to work up to the mark on during the presentation part of it or the output part of it. So what is your perception in that matter? Is it so or it is not so? I may be my wrong person.
I don't think so. I don't think there's a, I think I think architecture education has common pitfalls, whether it's east or west. Doing case studies that you have studying buildings that you've never visited and calling it a case study is a common pitfall I've seen in China and Australia and India. Then students almost never really having, whether it's India or Australia, never really having a sense of structures. What the hell is structures and what is tectonics? What is structure and what is tectonics?
True.
Both places you'll have the same issue. I mean, I'm seeing there are some common pitfalls. Analysis, I would say things like kind of design iterations. I think at least I've seen students tend to get stuck. And how to get. So I think with the students I've seen overseas, that they tend to take a bit more risk, because I think that element has to be there. If you can't produce the best section, and so again the question is where are we going to place the emphasis? Every student cannot be good at everything at every studio. So the question is where can we place the emphasis, and where can we remove the emphasis for that particular studio, so that the student is able to focus on certain aspects. So I think that freedom is there overseas. I think which we are more rigorous. I think in India we are a lot more rigorous, and we don't want to make any compromises. So I don't think it was a compromise. I think it's more about just changing the emphasis, not about removing an element, but it's about just saying, okay, if this is 20% important, maybe this is 50% important, maybe this is 70% important, but we are doing everything.
That metrics should vary depending upon the studios.
Thank
you, ma'am.
Okay. I think now we may take the last question, if I'm not wrong, from one of our colleagues, that is co-faculties, Mr. Kintan Shah. Kintan, I've unmuted you. Could you please proceed with your question, and you have a certain observation?
Yeah.
Yes.
So good evening, ma'am. Am I audible?
Yes.
Okay. So first of all, thank you for this interesting session. I'm sure students and faculties have equally benefited from this entire process that you showed to us of how a studio was conducted. There's one important observation that I want to put forward with reference to the process that was created, and that is about how we inculcate a sense of flexibility, or a sense of accepting the change in our ideas itself with time and with demanding situations. That is a very important characteristics I feel which needs to be developed in a student, in order to break his or her rigidity in terms of his or her ideas, the initial ideas that we may call it. And I find this process has probably successfully tried to do that and achieve it. There is one question that I have in mind. It might be a repetition, I'm not sure, but so when we try similar kind of activities or exercises in studio, students have been receptive to a narrative kind of approach or a pure architectural expression. But when it comes to translating a narrative or a graphic into an architectural expression and passing through the architectonic kind of exercise that you showed, we have not been that successful. So could you just elaborate more on how we could take the student from that narrative stage to the final design output?
I think, Kintan, this is one of the problems that we all face. How to make students convert tangible, intangible
Yeah, yeah.
expression. Yes, yes. Please, ma'am. Over to you.
Hmm. I think I'm going to focus on the part that talks about architectural expression. See, there's a level of abstraction which, again, I'm probably saying this second time again, saying that it's actually really important for students to understand how space and materials can actually make you feel certain things, whether they are emotions, right? A space can make you feel comfortable or uneasy or anxious or happy. It's possible. It is possible. So, like we talked about this idea of the non-verbal. I think was it Harshit? I think I was responding to somebody's question about this idea that we have a non-verbal tool in our hands, and how do we make it say that, or how do we make somebody feel that? So I think that is, and that thing is extremely abstract for students. So even for our students, for a lot of time, they think they're just playing with cardboard. They're just playing with materials and cardboard. For them, they're not really able to inhabit it, because so I'm again going back to this idea that if you can take them, so for instance, when you enter a temple, or when you enter a market, or even when you enter an old house, there is a certain sensory quality that is made possible by a very specific volume of space, amount of light that comes in, and the kind of materials, the textures. It is a very, very deliberate and a very designed act. If we can make students appreciate that, then you can really go from that idea of the narrative, emotion, memory, to architectural expression. Otherwise, it'll just be like, well, something, just planes. But that doesn't mean you'll feel anything. It doesn't mean that the space will talk to you, right? So I think it's important part. And when we talked about this idea of integration, right? We go for RSPs and we go for case study visits, and a lot of our case studies are now done online. We don't even go and visit them. A lot of our students don't even do like physical case studies. I think it's a problem, because if you don't understand an inhabited space, for students, this idea is extremely abstract. They're just playing with cardboard. I get really excited when I see them making those forms. I get so excited. Oh my God, I can see a building, and I get it. I can see it. They can't see it because they haven't seen a lot of buildings. At second year level, how many buildings have you seen? You're designing buildings, but you haven't visited a lot of buildings. And you don't really understand the spatial, sensory, material, tectonic qualities of these spaces, So I think it's very difficult to do that in studio if there's no life experience. You're designing something you've never seen. So I have the same challenge as you. I don't think your challenge is unique. I think we had very similar challenges to get students to see, that, oh, they're just playing with cardboard. So what, ma'am? So what? Like, it's just, so why are you getting so excited? They would just be like, why are you getting so excited? I'm like, because we can see the potentials, when students combine materials and volumes in a certain way, we know what that might feel like, right? So I think the answer to that question is that we have to build in greater level of immersive learning in our curriculum. I think that is incredibly important. Architecture education cannot be a classroom or a studio-driven process only. And that's where our RSPs and case studies have to be. They have to be immersive, hands-on, experiential. They have to be experiences. They cannot be, they cannot be something that you see on a screen or see in a classroom. If you don't walk into a space, you can't design it. So we're just saying, for a second or third year students, what are they designing? What have they seen, right? So I think it's a challenge, but no, hopefully, thank you for your observation. I hope for our students, it would have built in some amount of, as you're saying, the flexibility. I think you talked about this idea of being flexible and being open to this idea of exploration. What is exploration? I hope.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you.
Okay. So I think we are done here. And I'll just unmute Professor Bhagajit Raul so that he can give away the vote of thanks. Yes, Bhagajit, you could proceed.
Yes, ma'am. Once again, thanks a lot for accepting our invitation. This is the first ever webinar hosted by our college, and you will be remembered for that. That we initiated with you, and I am sure we look forward to your presence again one more time in the campus. We'll again invite you for with any other topic as well. And thanks a lot to all the studios for remaining, or the students for remaining present and attending the seminar presently. Thank you. Thank you, Maulik. Thank you, Chintan, for hosting and co-hosting the webinar. Thank you all.
Okay.
Thank you, and thank you. I thought it was a very well-attended webinar. There were so many students there today. It was very good to see. Wonderful audience.
Before we depart, ma'am, Maulik was telling you about your online course. If you can brief the students about that, they will also register.
Maulik, have you already shown them the...
I just shared my screen, and I'd shown the page of ASEG. I think I'll just do it just for a while. I'll do it.
So you can throw more light on that.
Yes. So
thank you, sir. Thank you. Thank you.
This was the page which I showed, ma'am. So you can, or you could share your screen and you can.
No. I think Maulik, you're on the right page. So you're the success story. So, so did you tell them of your experience and you showed them your publication?
No, actually, I just told them that this was a course which was offered by this online platform of ASEG, and it is created by Dr. Anuradha Chatterjee. That's what I told. And I've not mentioned the details of the course because I just mentioned in one line that it was about this reading historic urban surfaces through different lenses. But I don't know how far they would understand this. I think they can understand only when they get enrolled and learn from you. Because
if there are any questions, they can be sent. I think Maulik, I'm happy to field it through you if you can moderate that. No?
Yes,
if there is any interest. No?
And like yes, I showed them that see this was my essay that I could write after learning from Anuradha madam, and it is also there on this ASH platform they've posted. So it has helped me definitely in improvising the way I write and in perceiving historic urban surfaces with help of different lenses such as order, decorum, theatrical urbanity, and different other lenses. I mean, I don't want to get into too much of details, because I think it will be heavy for you to understand in a very short time span. You have to enroll for that. But definitely one thing that we have done is that we have listed this course as one of the possible options which students can take up as a part of their subject of RSP, Relevant Study Program.
That's a really good idea, Maulik. And is it? But in terms of the COVID restriction, how are we going to handle that?
Yes, that is one thing that if they select a monument the way you had made all the participants select a particular monument, and you had given an exercise as a part of this studio where we had to go for sort of perceiving the urban surface of that particular monument and describe it through those lenses. So what is we actually monuments and went there in person. Right now maybe they could go for study of those front facades of those monuments with help of photographs available from the internet, and then maybe
photographs available from the internet. For sure. And also they don't have to be also, I think Google might be a good, Google Cultural Institute or even Google Street View overseas. They don't have to be I think that's also possible, or buildings they have seen before as well.
True. So that's it. I think we can leave the meeting now. Okay. Thank you.
May I ask quickly which your students have been attending this today? Just to get an idea.
Just a minute. I'll unmute Bhagajit. Just a minute. I'm trying to unmute him, but.
These are primary year students. First, second, and third year students were there, and some of the diploma architecture students were also there. So they were the participants in today's session and the faculty members, mainly who are teaching in the junior studios from first to fifth semester.
Wonderful. Thank you. Lovely to see you all.
Thank you.
Thank you. Same here.
Thank you all.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye bye.
Thank